So we are we're in our third session, and we're looking at mutualistic ministry is the idea that I'm looking at here. And so last week, Michael walked us through what it means to be human, or our last session, I should say. And the session before that, Krista gave us a look at how disability rhetoric, disability language has shifted and changed through the years. And so for today's session, what we're going to be looking at is I'm trying to bridge the gap here between theory and practice. I sent a text to the text chain of the Lazarus Center peeps of Kathy, Krista, Michael, and myself last night, and I was like, guys, here's my nerd out thing where my job here is to bridge the theoretical and the practical. But what I don't want us to think is that theory and practice are like two separate things. They're actually two things on the same continuum, right? So all of our practice is theoretical and all of our theory has practical implications to it. So it's not that some people are theoretical and some people are practical. It's a continuum. And my job is to help us bring us from more of the theoretical over to the practical. And because we're Christians, everything that we do is also theological and pastoral. And so that's why this session will feel a little bit like we're starting to shift into some of the practice-based things. But next session is when that continuum lands even further on the practice side, where Kathy's going to come in and help us think through some more of the praxis or pragmatic or practical implications of the things we've been talking about. Okay. So rather than thinking of it as two separate buckets that you can either be a theoretical or you can be practical, let's think of it as a continuum, and we're just moving along that continuum together. So here's our Lazarus Center kind of mission statement, vision statement. I don't know which one it's called. It's our big one. Whatever one's the top at the white paper. That's what this is. That we believe the church is a place where persons of all disabilities can thrive within the body as saints and ministers of the gospel. So that's the saying that undergirds what we do as a little collective, and what we're trying to encourage others along in this journey. And that's what you're kind of being invited into with this course of starting here with an understanding of disability in the church. So what I'm calling that sentence in kind of a like phrase is mutualistic ministry. I'm saying that if we do that, if our belief about a church actually comes into practice, what that's going to look like is mutualistic ministry, meaning that ministry, if this statement gets lived out in our churches, ministry is not a hierarchical, top-down teacher-student. As Christians, we recognize that we are all students of Jesus. And because we're all students of Jesus, that means all of our interactions with one another will have places where we can contribute and places where we can receive. And so that's really the heart of a mutualistic ministry, is approaching our ministry with a theory of mutuality, with a mindset of saying, I'm going to approach every relationship as though I have something to contribute and also I have needs to receive. And I think the Lord helped us apply that by my botching Zoom right off the bat. Right? We experienced mutualistic ministry already today because I came in being like the teacher guy and I have the answers and I have my PowerPoint and I even have notes on my PowerPoint and I'm ready to go. And Jolene prays and we're set and I'm ready to lead the charge. And then I realized very quickly how limited I am. And that played out in my inability to actually figure out how to make Zoom work in a way that you don't see my top secret notes. So I could either now be totally rattled for the rest of the day because the hierarchy, teacher student kind of glass window or glass wall has been broken, or I could be like, hey, I'm a person, which means I have something to bring and I also have needs that need to be met. And so we can thank the Lord for a little illustration right off the bat of what a mutualistic ministry looks like. So here's what we're going to look at. we're looking at mutualistic ministry. This is us trying to, this is how we're going to answer the question, how is it that persons with disabilities, are not just people to care for, but are actually people to learn from, be discipled by, and co-labor with. Um, so I'm calling that idea mutualistic ministry. So first, we'll look at the purpose of mutualistic ministry. I always like starting with a goal. What are we actually trying to do with the thing we're out to do? Um, and then we're going to look at a biblical foundation and then a bit of a pastoral, ministerial, practical framework. And for point 3, if you've heard me at the Lazarus Center Assess the Interest meetings, my apologies for reusing the same material. But that's my sorry, not sorry moment, because we at the Lazarus Center think it's a really helpful framework for us to have these conversations. So that part will feel like a repeat if you've been at those meetings, but you'll get to hear the ways that I, blow you away with that presentation this time compared to last time, or do it worse than I did it in real person. So first, let's start with the purpose of mutualistic ministry. And just so you guys know, the way this is going to go is this is going to be kind of like, I'll do some talking at you. I'll have slides. We'll do more of a breakout session where we can talk about this together at the end. But as you already know, my skills with Zoom are limited. And so if you have something you want to say, just feel free to unmute yourself, interrupt me, particularly if some of you are on the chat. I loved last session with the chat. It had its own little world on the chat, different from the presentation. And I think that's super helpful for some people. So I'm going to ignore the chat unless someone decides to bring something from the chat to my attention. Okay. So I'm going to trust that you guys are going to be having a great time over there in chat land, and you guys can bring it up if you want to. So let's talk about the purpose of mutualistic ministry first. So repeating the phrase, we believe the church is a place where persons of all disabilities can thrive within the body as saints and ministers of the gospel. So the question is, what's the purpose of gospel ministry? If we're saying that people are ministers of the gospel, what are we trying to do when we say gospel ministry? So here's my my idea. That might seem like a simplistic question. It might seem like hey, we all know what the purpose of gospel ministry is. But my experience in church ministry is the things that we don't make crystal clear typically get lost. They get lost in the sauce later, and we end up missing out on what the actual thing we're trying to do is because we get busy with all the other things around it. So every once in a while, I think it's helpful for us to be like, wait, what are we trying to do here again? So what is the goal of gospel ministry? Different traditions and different streams of Christianity have different ways of saying basically the same thing. In the Eastern tradition, they use the language of theosis, which is this idea of becoming more like God, the process of becoming more like Him. The Western tradition doesn't use the word theosis; it uses the word sanctification, which is this idea of kind of growing in holiness, growing in our the sanctified sanctity, this idea of kind of being set apart. So the Western tradition uses that language. Contemporary language, you are probably familiar with some famous authors now who use the language of spiritual formation, which is kind of like a more generic way of saying the same thing. But I'm going to use a different word altogether because that's what teachers in these kinds of settings do, is they try to be original and they try to say something like, I'm saying it better than everyone else before. But I'm not saying it better. I'm just saying it different for our own purposes. I think it's helpful to think about the purpose of gospel ministry is Christoformity. I don't think I'm making that word up. I'm sure other people have used it, but I think it's a helpful phrase or word to use because I think what it does is it kind of encapsulates the Eastern tradition, the Western tradition, and our contemporary language under one word that has like Jesus kind of built into it, where it's not just that we're trying to become some vague God-like character, and it's not just that we're trying to become like holier than thou people, and it's not that we're trying to become like a generally, vaguely spiritually formed person. The goal of gospel ministry is actually for us to become more and more like Jesus. Um, that's the goal of gospel ministry. And so, one verse among many that we're going to look at here, or among a few, I should say, that I think talks about this is 2 Corinthians 3, where Paul says, "Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom." That that freedom that's being referred to is in contrast to being having our eyes veiled to who God is. So Paul was just finished talking about Moses, who would veil his face after being in the presence of the Lord, so that the Israelites didn't see the glory. And then Paul says that's kind of like how people view uh, the Mosaic tradition. That's how people view the law, is with these veiled faces. And what we need is to have our being veiled freed up so we actually can see who God is. So now Paul is saying where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom to have the veil removed. And then he says, we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. So here Paul's being really clear. Like, the goal of the Christian life is looking into contemplating the Lord's glory, and in so doing, being transformed into his image with an ever increasing glory. Paul uses this same idea of Christoformation in other passages. So here's three other reference points for us. 1 Thessalonians 4, he uses the language of being sanctified. He says this is the God's will for your life, that you should be sanctified. Galatians 4:19, Paul talks about the pains of childbirth, like any good Christian dude who's like, I know what that's like. I know the pains of childbirth. And then all the women reading the letter are like, do you? Interesting, Paul. Um, but he's like, my dear children, for whom I am again in the pains of childbirth, for what? Until Christ is formed in you. That's why Paul does the ministry he does. And then Romans 8:29, in a more kind of theologically dense section, Paul says, for those God foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his son. So here in Romans, Paul is saying that the purpose for which God's predestining and foreknowing, which is like its own class of theology of talking through those words, but the purpose for those things is confirmation into the image of his son. And so I think it's totally fair for us to say that we believe, as the Lazarus Center, and what we're hoping churches can come on board with, is that we believe that the church is a place where persons of all disabilities can thrive within the body as saints and ministers of the gospel, which will play out in ways that look like a mutualistic, every person helping every person look more and more Christ formed in their life. So that's the purpose of gospel ministry. Like, don't get me wrong, I love church multiplication. I love church planting. I think the church is is God's way of reaching the world with the gospel. But I think sometimes we as ministers and leaders can be distracted by lots of good things and forget the primary ultimate thing of the purpose of ministry, which is why I think persons of different abilities and disabilities sometimes feel like they don't fit our plans for the church, because we wonder what they can contribute to our desire for bigger buildings, bigger ministries, uh, deeper leadership teams, more conferences, that kind of stuff. And we forget the primary goal of what all those things point to, which is Christoformation. So this is me just saying the quiet part out loud, where if we don't remember the main point of what we're out for, the rest of the conversation becomes a little bit harder to wrap our minds around the practice. And as pastors, we're so frequent to tell people, hey, one of the best ways you are going to grow in your own faith, or however we use it, is to serve, right? And if part of our job is to shepherd persons of all abilities, we also have to find legitimate ways for all persons to serve so they can grow.
I just had one. one sort of thought about Christoformity is what do we envision when we envision being formed into into the form of Christ?
Mhm.
Um, so really, that's a way of saying like, how do we know when we're growing as disciples? How do we know when we're becoming the people that God wants us to be and enables us to be? And what sort of people do we have in mind? How do we envision ourselves when we have that in mind?
Mhm.
And I know that you've talked about this before, and we've talked about this before, but um, then this speaks a bit to Eric's question, like how much of how much of that imagination or what we see when we ask that question is a quite ableist vision,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? So we all envision ourselves as 30 and in full command of our bodies and you know, healthy and bright eyed all the time. And not that I'm saying like we know we're being sanctified when we turn out miserable, but it is to say that I was just thinking of it saying like, show me somebody whose Bible is falling apart because they read it so much and their life is together. Like I'll show you a person whose life is together. Like you know that somebody is has deepened in their faith when the Bible that they read all the time is falling apart because they've poured over it so much. Like how does that offer us an analogy for like Christoformity?
Mhm.
That we don't shy away from um getting older or needing each other or right having some of those rough edges. And maybe those are things of God. Maybe those aren't things to hide. Maybe that is what Christofornia means as compared to the, you know, healthy, wealthy image that a lot of us imagine when we imagine a sanctified, mature disciple.
Yeah.
Well, I recall like 2 weeks ago, there was this really,
Mm.
intelligent faculty, of Northwest, and he was saying something along the lines of, you know, being made in the image of Christ. It's not a what, but a who. Smart
Mhm.
guy.
That guy's great. Love that guy. No, you're right. You're right, Michael. And I think, um, for the sake of this time, I'm gonna punt that back to the kind of conversation we had before. But that I think you're right in drawing that out. Um, okay, so now let's talk about mutualistic ministry because that's what I was asked to talk about. Uh, let's look a little bit at some biblical foundations for this. I think the people in the room, you will not be hard to persuade, but I want to persuade you anyways. So um, here's the biblical foundation for mutualistic ministry. I love triangles. I think they're the Lord's shape. And I don't know why that one uh, part of the quote is facing the other way, but it is. Uh, so a biblical foundation. We're going to look at two Corinthian passages, and then we're going to look at some of Paul's other one another passages. I have found in disability theology, Paul actually a really rich source for talking about disability theology, and that might surprise some people. But I think, I love the other books of the Bible too, but I've found Paul's language probably some of the most helpful in talking through these things. So a passage that'll be really familiar to a lot of you is 1 Corinthians 12. I'm just going to read it. I'll make a few brief comments, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Um, but Paul says this, um, just as one body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we are all baptized by one Spirit, so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free. And we are all given the one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but of many. So Paul's playing with the body image here. He goes on by saying, now, if the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has placed the parts of the body, every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. So, just briefly, I want to point out here what Paul is drawing the attention to is people who self select out of the body because they feel different from the other parts of the body. And Paul is saying to the person who self-selects out because they say, I don't belong because I'm not like you. Paul says that's not how a body works. And we know that because the body is not one just giant floating eyeball. It is a multi-part body incorporating all kinds of things. Therefore, if you feel different from everyone else, don't interpret that as not being necessary for the body. Now he's going to continue this body imagery by saying this: the eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. And the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. Verse 22 is really important. And the parts that we think are less honorable, we treat with special honor. And the parts that are presentable are unpresentable, are treated with special modesty, while our presentable parts need no special treatment. Just pausing here one more time. Paul here is now drawing attention to those people who say, because that person isn't like me, they don't belong. And so the first category Paul was addressing was people who self-select out. And now in this part, Paul is addressing those who exclude on the basis of the difference of the other. And Paul says probably the underlying reason for the exclusion is because those people seem to be weaker than the other parts. They seem to be less valuable. And yet Paul says that's not how the body works. And then Paul does something really interesting where he says, actually, those who seem to be weaker are indispensable. And then he draws attention to this by talking about like clothing and the kinds of clothing that you and I choose to wear. And because it's Zoom, I can't say with 100% confidence, but I'm like 99% sure that everyone here is wearing pants. So you don't have to prove it if you're not, because that would not be appropriate, because then you would not be showing special modesty. But when you and I dress ourselves in the morning, we show special honor to certain parts of our body, not because they are unimportant, but because they are indispensable and important. And so Paul's drawing the attention to that kind of a illustration in his conversation about the necessity of parts of the body that seem to be weaker, but we think they're weaker only because they're different. And Paul knows that when it comes to the body, all parts work together in an indispensable way. And then Paul says, God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. You and I, again, we know this to be true with our bodies. If everything's going great and then all of a sudden you get a neck injury, you can't just walk around your rest of your day being like, you know what, my body's doing awesome, except my neck is killing me. But besides that, like having a great day. You know, if one part of your body is suffering, you know that impacts the totality of who you are. And this is what Paul's drawing the attention to. And he's saying, look, if there are parts of our ecclesial church body that are suffering, we don't have the option of saying, yeah, but we're good. We're good, because that's just like our hand, or that's just our foot, or that's just our neck. Paul's like, actually, we all know that when one part of the body suffers, all parts suffer with it. So that's one part of the triangle is Paul's theology of the body. That's part of our biblical foundation. Another one, we're going to skip that question for now, just for sake of time. The next part that I want to look at is some of the one another passages that Paul talks about that help us understand the mutuality of ministry. Paul says this in a few different places. If you want to do a word study on Paul and his use of the one another's, that could be really interesting. Actually, just as a little throwaway resource for you, if you aren't familiar, there's a program called the Step Bible. I think it's stepbible.org. And it's like the best one-stop shop for word studies for those of us who aren't like super expert in the original languages. You can go to stepbible.org, you can type in the passage, and then you can hover over different words, And then when you click the word, it'll show you on another window all the places where that word shows up in the Bible. And then you can click on all those numbers and it'll just automatically list it. I know there's other Bible software tools that do the same thing, but this is just like a free online, super intuitive way to do it. If you want to look up all the one another passages of Paul's teaching, um, you could do it easily by using Step Bible resource. And also you will be blown away by how important the one another's are in Paul's theology. It is everywhere and how Paul understands the church. Here's 3 examples. Paul in Colossians 3 says, "Let the message of Christ dwell in you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit." 1 Thessalonians 5:11, "Therefore encourage one another and build one another up just as you are doing." Romans 5:14, he says, "I myself am convinced, my brothers and sisters, that you yourselves are full of goodness, uh, filled with knowledge and competent to instruct one another." For Paul, um, it seems clear to me that he sees ministry in the local church as not a um, decidedly hierarchical dynamic. There are absolutely leaders, and there are teachers, and there are pastors, and there are evangelists, yes. But in our context, we easily plug those into org charts and into hierarchical structures, whereas I think it misses the overall flow of Paul's teaching about the body, which is that the way the body grows, the way the church grows, is through a one another kind of ministry. Um, that does require leadership, absolutely, but a leadership that is designed to facilitate and curate a one another kind of dynamic in the body. Um, third third part of the triangle, and then we'll open it back up for some conversation. Um, Paul in 2 Corinthians 12 talks about his own experience. And in the context, he's using this really funny, like, I once knew a guy who had this crazy experience of going to the third heaven. And he's not just like, it's kind of like when John is like, there's a disciple that the Lord loves, and he's a lot faster than Peter. It's these like humble brag moments of the apostles that part of me is like, just say it, man. Like, you were caught up to the third heaven. Just own it. But he uses this kind of language of, this was my experience, or this was some guy's experience. And then he says, therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited because of his like crazy, amazing personal experience that the Lord brought him on, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul, so this passage might not seem on the face of it to be like a big like mutuality text, but I actually think it is, because what Paul is saying here is the very thing that we presume to be the way that God will use us most is our strengths and our autonomy and our independence and our capabilities. And yet Paul here is saying it's actually our weaknesses through which God makes his power. The language there is perfect. It's this language of reaching a thing, reaching its intended goal. So in this sense, it's like the word of perfect, like a car is perfect when you can actually drive it off the lot. That's when a car is perfect, is because it's functioning according to its intended goal. And this is what Paul's saying, is that God's power is perfect in our weaknesses. And this is one of those places where like people who have high views of the Bible everyone who has high views of the Bible, we all pick and choose the places where we take the Bible seriously and the places where we don't. And this is one of those passages where people with high views of the Bible, if you actually ask them if their ministry models reflected Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, they would probably be hesitant to say yes, because how we design our churches is strength based and gift based, and the demonstration and elevation of those with the greatest strengths and the most skills and the most independence and the most autonomy. And we value and esteem those people. And we neglect or relegate or just straight out exclude people who don't have those same characteristics, which I think is part of why our churches are struggling so much, is because the primary way that God wants to express his power through our weakness is the very thing that we are hiding in the background. And if we were saying to ourselves, actually, every single person here is necessary, they have things to contribute and things to receive, even not in spite of, but because of their weaknesses, I think that would make a ministry of mutuality a lot more um, like exciting and fun and necessary and like spirit filled and kingdom feeling.
I would just say that one of the things that occurred to me as you were presenting is that there is a galvanizing effect when we commit to this way of doing church. So what Paul is describing with the body and how God has set it up so that those who are dishonored and lowered are elevated and or honored,
Mm.
and to be um, it's not just for them. And I was thinking about this in terms of the man who is paralyzed being lowered down from the roof, that we tend to focus on the friends as the primary agents there. But if you look at what Paul is doing here, um, it's actually the person who is on the mat that is the galvanizer.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's him who is shaping the friends into the type of people that would even conceive of going to the lengths they did to bring them to Jesus. And how does all of that not just transform the guy being lowered down, but transform the friends too? And I think this is what Paul is trying to do, is like, this is your discipleship plan for your church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So now let's look at a bit of a pastoral framework. So for those of you who have come to one of our Assess the Interest meetings, my apologies for some of the repeat, but hopefully it's helpful hearing it again. Um, so here's the big idea of a pastoral framework for mutualistic ministry. It's that persons of all disabilities belonging as co-laborers in gospel ministry is the biblical vision for the local church. This is something that I will probably not be hard to persuade you of because you're in this class. Um, but that's kind of the big idea undergirding everything you're going to see in these next few moments. Okay. So there are 5 stages for a mutualistic ministry among persons of disabilities. I'm taking a lot of this material from the Wheaton Center for Faith and Disability, so thank you to them. And this isn't original to me. This is just me repackaging what they have done. As you can see in the background, there's this like emerging tree that is growing in the background that eventually will bear fruit. But that tree starts from a seed. And so I think it's important as we talk about moving this conversation along the continuum from theory to practice, is recognizing that different churches are going to start this conversation in different places. And the first place that it starts is not actually at a seed in the soil. The first place where it starts is actually either our church is being hard ground to this conversation or soft ground to this conversation. In other words, when we start talking about persons of all abilities and all disabilities being co-laborers, belonging as co-laborers for the gospel, there are some churches that will hear that and it will immediately bounce off of them because they aren't even prepared to have this conversation or even start having the conversation, which is frustrating and discouraging, but is the lived experience of a lot of people. And one of the things that I'm a big believer in is just let's be honest with where we're at as individuals and where we're at with the institutions that we're a part of. Um, and the reality is that the institutions we're a part of might be hard ground. And the good news is that under all pavement is dirt because God made the dirt and we made the pavement. And so we can get to soft ground. It usually takes something like a little bit more uh, destructive than kind words and thoughts and prayers. It usually requires, and I think all of us in our lives, um, there was something that broke the hard ground of our own hearts and minds about this conversation. And it was probably a person in our lives that caused us to realize, oh my goodness, I was building my whole life off of the asphalt of the hard ground towards persons who are different than me. And now I'm confronted with this person or this situation, and I'm feeling like the Lord is taking a jackhammer to to the ground that has been built above the soil. Um, but I'm presuming that a lot of you are already at the soft ground where the asphalt's been broken away for whatever reason. And now the conversation is finding the soft ground in your own life and hopefully in your church. And so once the seed finds soft ground, um, there is growth that will take place if that is cultivated. So now we're going to start along the path of the different stages of ministry, mutualistic ministry among persons of all disabilities. The way every person's journey starts in this conversation is with ignorance. Um, the tricky part about hard ground and soft ground is that ignorance can happen at soft ground places and at hard ground places. And so just because someone's ignorant doesn't necessarily mean they're hard ground. It just means they're at the first stage. And here's the kind of phrase that you might hear from someone who is ignorant in this conversation. They might say something like this: weaknesses and disabilities are a sign of sin or lack of faith, and I don't have interest in getting to know people with disabilities. That's a hard thing to hear, but it's a thing that you will hear in both a hard ground context and also at the very first stage of the soft ground context as well. But ignorance can turn into pity. Um, Pity sounds something like this: I'm glad that my children are not disabled. People with disabilities need help from people like me to make sure that they have a meaningful life. So there's still this like strong us and them language. There's the those people and there's the me kind of people. And the those people are so lucky to have the me people. Um, and I would not wish on anyone the experience of those people. And I'm really glad that my family doesn't experience life like those people, but man, am I glad that those people have me, right? That's pity. And it's not said as like caustically and sarcastically as that. It's often said with like warmth and genuine earnestness, because what's happening in those people's lives and in their words is growth is happening. It just hasn't happened far enough. And one of the most frustrating things for those of us who have lived experiences with disabilities or have children with lived experiences of disabilities is that we can get mad at people at pity for not being further along. And instead of us trying to find ways to, make that plant grow, because at least they're not ignorant, we can sometimes squelch that growth by saying something in our weak moments, which is understandable. But also, trees take time to grow, and people take time to grow, and Christoformity takes time. And so we have to be patient with people and gently correct and curate and garden their approach to things, because pity will eventually, if the growth continues, turn into care. And care will start looking like this. People will say something like this: people with disabilities are imago Dei. They listened to Michael's talk and they are on board, man. They are made in God's image and they have value. And therefore, we need to find ways to help those people and their families. So notice that in the care language, we are still living in this kind of us and them dynamic. My son just busts into the room. We're still living with an us and them dynamic. There's us and there's them, but there's at least this recognition that the them are inherently valuable because they are Imago Dei, and therefore we need to find ways to help them. So that's care, and we're starting to see some more leaves grow, and then it moves on to friendship. Friendship can sound something like this: my friend with disabilities is an important part of my life, and we've learned from each other, and I'm glad to initiate relationship with people who have disabilities. Um, this is a great start, a great place to start seeing kind of the fruitfulness take place, um, where you can tell real growth is happening. And usually friendship will over time turn into, with a little bit of tending and pruning, um, this place of co-laborship, of co-laborers with one another. And co-laboring sounds something like this. It sounds like if God has called each of us to be a part of the body, then each and every one is necessary to build the body to do every good work that God has called us to do. So friendship can turn into co-laboring, and that's when we notice the fruit. The fruit of mutualistic ministry emerges when you have people recognizing the necessity of each person rather than the dispensability of some and the privileging of others. It's this place where you're saying, actually, it's not just that I like having that person in my life, which is friendship. It's that I need that person to accomplish what God has for us. That if we don't have that person a part of the body, we are less than what God intends us to be. That's when co-laboring fits in. So there's a few things that actually take place to move this growth along. From ignorance to pity, it takes awareness. Um, and that's some of that soil breaking work. That's some of that, having conversations, putting real faces, real names. I remember sitting in rooms and in meetings at a ministry context I was in previously, and conversations would happen and decisions would be made. And I would, because I'm this kind of personality, I would say, oh, so the way we're planning that event is like my son can't come to it then? And they're like, wow. And I'm like, no, I'm just saying the quiet part out loud. So like, if we do it that way, that means my son can't come. So I should just ask my wife to stay home and not bring our son to it. Is that's the plan we're going with? And oftentimes the response was yes. But those words sunk in with some people around the table. And they're like, it's actually kind of crazy that we would be okay with a plan that would knowingly ostracize a part of your actual family. And you're on the leadership team here. And what happened there was awareness is being brought. And for those who have soft ground, they were moved from an ignorance to not even thinking about how this might impact my son, which is fair. They don't live with him every day. And they would move from ignorance to pity because now they're thinking, oh my gosh, well, like, that's not right. We don't know how to fix it, but we don't like it. Um, Awareness will then move into this access point with care where they'll say, oh my gosh, we should do something for your son, right? Like that's something like we are good people who love Jesus and we should do this thing so that your son can be there. Access turns into inclusion, which is basically when people are saying, we're going to do things to make sure that actually Greg doesn't have to say things at the table about, won't this ostracize my son? We're going to do things in a way where we're already on board with the fact that like, we like Benji. He's a cool guy. So let's do things so that he can be there, which eventually will turn into this stage of belonging, of this recognition that the mindset flips to say, actually, if we do this in such a way, and that means Benji can't be there, we will miss out. Not just that he could be included, but that he belongs to us. And therefore, for us to do this in a way that he's not able to engage with actually is to our detriment. Um, and so that's kind of the 5 stages of mutualistic ministry among persons of all disabilities. My thesis, my idea, something that I'm like getting closer to thinking is going to be a part of my dissertation work is actually that if you want to move from stage 3 to stage 4 as a church, if you want to move from care to friendship, our existing structures and paradigms and systems have to be reworked. That how we do church in North America among evangelicals cannot get us beyond care without us making significant changes. And so that's why, again, I'm a big proponent of honesty is the best policy, of recognizing am I the kind of person who would be willing to disrupt enough of how things work to get further along the spectrum, um, or not? And is our church the kind of place? Like, honestly, are the people in the leadership positions that they're in and the structures that exist within the systems that we're in, would they be willing to make the kinds of changes? I don't have the answer for all what the changes would need to be. I just know that we will bump up against brick walls if we try to make this kind of friendship and co-laboring happen in our churches. And asking ourselves the question, do I think our institution is actually willing to make those changes or not? How far along could our church actually be, or our organization actually get along this way? So I have way more questions than answers. Now from this point on, my expertise has ended right there. That's as far as I go. And now I'm joining all of us in the conversation of, man, what does it look like to actually do this? And like, I'm a lead pastor at a church. Like, is my church with the people we have and the structures we have and the systems we have, is my church actually willing to do things differently in such a way that we can move beyond care? Um, so Kathy's going to do a callback for us back to these 5 stages. We're going to start our next session reminding ourselves of these 5 stages, and she's going to start talking about how to do ministry in these different places and different ways and different areas of growth. So we're not going to finalize it all today. We're going to continue the conversation into the more practical next time, but we wanted this in your head as we have that conversation in our next session and moving forward, because we think it's a helpful framework to move from. I think the thing that might be most helpful for you to talk about is, where do you think your church is or your organization is on that continuum of the 5 stages? Um, yeah, and your answer might be your church is hard soil or hard ground, and that's just being honest, and that's okay. But it might be helpful for us to try to start using that framework in our conversation about where do we think our church would actually, where are we now and where could we be with the way things are?
Thank you so much, Greg, for this preparation and this presentation. And I've got so much to think about now. It was a real blessing being on here and having the opportunity to host as well. So thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thanks, Julian. Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Take care.